Hello, and welcome once again to The Close Read, your official podcast for the Claremont Review of Books. I am your host, Spencer Klavan, Associate Editor of the Claremont Review of Books, and I am joined for our very last spring 2026 episode by none other than Emmet Penney, a returning guest to the program, but with a new essay, The Great Leap Forward, How China Overtook the U.S. Emmet, welcome back to The Close Read.
Good to be back.
Yeah, great to have you. And as I mentioned, this is going to be the last in our series of spring 2026 episodes. After this, it's all America 250 all the time, baby. So this is going to be yes, let's go. Exactly. I think this is going to be perhaps a slightly slightly depressing about the state of America in the world. Maybe not, we'll see. But beyond this point, there will be no doomerism allowed. So we have to get all of our bleak, negative predictions about spiritual nihilism in the America and the West out of our system so that we can
through the cleansing fire of fireworks on the 4th, we will emerge as a phoenix. From this
like
posture.
A phoenix. Yeah. Exactly. Reborn and sloughed off of all our misery. And whoa. So here we go. Let's get into it. The Great Leap Forward, How China Overtook the U.S. This is I think that this is an extraordinary essay. It is in part a review of a number of books which you bring together and a number of stories, I think, that have become central to our understanding of U.S.-Asia relations, U.S.-China relations specifically. And these stories are told kind of in part in these books. And I think what you're doing in some way in these essays is you are making them part of one story. And I'm going to outline it as I typically do for our guests, and then give you an opportunity to complicate or add on to what I'm saying. The first part of this story is a somewhat familiar one, and that is the throwing open of America's gates to China, Japan, and in the East more generally, but especially in China, with the hope that economic liberties would lead to social liberalization and more generally to a kind of political openness, because one of the big questions, especially in the wake of the Cold War, was what do we do with our kind of remaining communist nations? And you tell this incredible story about David Hasselhoff being suspended by a crane singing Looking for Freedom near Brandenburg Gate in 1989 to give a flavor of the mood of this time. It's well known that like the economic prosperity materialized in China, the liberalism less so. Part of that went well, but not exactly the part that we were hoping for. But then there's this kind of more modern story emphasized especially by a recent book called Apple in China by Patrick McGee, which had caught my eye as well. And it's sort of about how Apple's production and assembly line got deeply, profoundly ensnared with China and with the CCP, all the while as Chinese companies like Huawei and others were kind of siphoning off skills, learning from Americans and especially from Apple how to build. And then finally, the last part, of course, is that at the same time, Americans are forgetting how to build. We're snarled up in all kinds of regulatory morass, and we've had famously, as Donald Trump, whom you discuss at length in this essay, Donald Trump is one of his big complaints is that we've lost our onshore capacity for manufacturing. And so when you put all of these pieces together, you get this very unnerving scenario that basically looks like China leapfrogging us using our own technology. Tell me where I got that wrong, or what needs adding on, and maybe just can you speak a little bit about this situation?
No, I think that's all right. I mean, in a way, this ends up being a story about victory defeating us to some degree. It is. I mean, if we can just put ourselves back to the moment where the Hoff is singing at Brandenburg Gate. What was felt to be for decades an eschatological conflict between the future of humanity as embodied in two different regimes, the USSR and the USA, comes to an end. And not in, world-ending fire. Importantly, right? So how could you emerge as anybody who's near any of the like regime leadership in America, anything but jubilation and also supreme confidence in the bets that one has made. I'll tell a little bit of a side story here. When I think about what must it have felt like to say, we can just expand capitalism and liberal democracy to every country on earth and everyone will conform to us. We are the historical aberration, which is the American regime, will now become the historical norm. I think about Rebecca Mark, who was a CEO at Enron. And one of the things that she wanted to do was privatize municipal water companies. And Enron went to do that through Azure X in South America. And one of the things she said about this was history need not apply to anything that we might do going forward. Unfortunately, Enron decided to do things like bring in British consultants to manage people who had a living memory of the Falkland Islands campaign. And those things didn't turn out so well as projects. And that's a synecdoche for what ends up happening in a larger sense with production. It's not just American industry's fault that it ends up in China. There are incentives to do that in some parts. Chamber of Commerce was very clear that it was open to this. NAFTA, while it shored some industries into America, made it also clear that it wasn't going to stop any American industries from offshoring either, and might even encourage that to some degree. And in the 60s and 70s, which I bring up, especially discussing the work of Paul Sabin and Dan Wang, his book Breakneck on China's Rise, is that America went through an administrative state internal regime change in the 60s and 70s. Now, what people like Christopher Caldwell and Charles Kessler's fantastic new book on the two constitutions and their crisis do is they dial in on the civil rights aspect of this, and I think that is often true. What gets neglected is what happens in environmental law, which also changes the register of our understanding of property rights and industry in America. And what we start doing is industrial policy for lawyers. We suddenly have these baroque administrative state laws around who can build what. And eventually, companies just start saying, well, I can just find third-party vendors, in China, in Shenzhen, in their special economic zone, collaborating with Taiwan, creating a triangle trade here. And that is way easier for me. And in fact, there are infrastructural things that move in that direction as well. It's not just China entering the WTO or anything like that. It is containerization in shipping. And it is also the rapid expansion and deepening power of telecom and information technology that makes this all possible. So if we put ourselves back into the early 90s, this is when this sort of emergent telos of this moment really feels like it's coming to bear. You can almost feel the tailwinds in this direction forming, not just in how people are speaking, but in how they're acting, where they're putting their money, where they're putting their talent. This eventually leads to Apple doing things like outsourcing all of its production. They sold one of their last factories just to keep the lights on in the 90s before they brought Steve Jobs back into Apple to eventually create the iMac. And that's because the costs were just too high, to maintain that real estate, to pay the operating costs, to keep the, payroll going is a lot. So they adopted a designed in Cupertino, built in China model. There's sort of two issues with that. Ultimately, it made Apple hugely independent, hugely dependent on China for all of its production. And there's only so much you can, how do I say this, divorce design and engineering or manufacturing without starting to lose a certain amount of luster in engineering, right? These things aren't, it's like that, there's not this stiff divide between theory and practice where you can just get really good in the abstract. People might think that to some degree, and that we've majored in designing chips at NVIDIA. Another piece I've written for CRB is on NVIDIA and how all that panned out. And
we love to think this way, I think, in modern contemporary West, is like these things can be divorced from each other, and the kind of idea expertise, the laptop job, is just, separate from the factory line job, and never the twain shall meet, which you're saying is just a kind of a fiction.
Yeah, I want to say that there are limits to it. To say that it's a complete fiction is to say that the world has not changed when clearly it has, and that, everyone needs to adapt. And I don't think we're going to return to this situation where we're back in the, glorious post-war years where America is the major foundry for all of industry. That is just not a rational picture of the future. That doesn't mean that we won't have manufacturing in this country. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't have manufacturing in this country. I think both those things are needed, especially in key economic areas, and especially to avoid China encircling us from across the globe and being able to cinch down on supply chains as leverage. To be clear, that is part of what they've done here, and all nations are feeling the bite of that. It has been a conscious strategy for a long time. In fact, onboarding all of this know-how through Foxconn in Taiwan via Shenzhen, where all of these Apple production facilities are, was a conscious strategy by the CCP, at least since the 80s, when they started to open up, when they needed to reassemble their regime structure in the wake of Mao.
A couple things to say about that story that you're telling. The first thing is that this idea you mentioned from Enron, that it's year zero and now the American way of life is going to become the way of life. It's quite intriguing to me to hear you talk about that, because at Claremont, we've recently been sort of discovering that strain of thought, or recovering that strain of thought in the American project more generally. I've done some writing on this. Chris Flannery has been talking about John Quincy Adams a lot, and we've talked, I think, already on this podcast once about the fact that, if you go back to that John Quincy Adams speech where he says, "We shall not go looking for monsters to destroy," everyone quotes that line as evidence that Quincy Adams was kind of a proto-isolationist or something. And then we don't read the rest of the speech, but the rest of the speech has this amazing and blisteringly optimistic through line about how the fire of liberty is going to blaze through the world. Watch out, tyrants, because your days are up. Simply by virtue of the fact that the United States of America now exists. And this is the key part of it that perhaps gets lost, is it's not about we're going to go and overthrow every dictator and effect regime change. It's about the mere presence of a new form of government upon the earth changes the situation so radically that in time, the self-evident justice of self-government and liberty and equality will make themselves known. And so you're going to see a kind of blaze of revolution passing across the world. And I think there's part of that is kind of just baked in. That's an impulse, an American impulse, or a way of thinking. Obviously, it hasn't turned out quite as neat and clean. And I don't want to caricature John Quincy Adams to be saying that was kind of what was going to happen with no speed bumps along the way. But there's a real, I think, diminution or a lack of confidence in that idea now. Like that old American spirit now, I think, is something that, at least on the right, and I think more generally, well, what I'm saying, certainly also on the left, people are highly, highly skeptical of that. And one important part of that is what you're saying about how it worked out on the business level. You tell this amazing story. One of the great anecdotes in this piece is at Foxconn, that Apple's, Apple goes, let me see if I can get this right, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong about this. Huawei, the Chinese company, has become the world's top smartphone company by sales, in part because Apple has been, offshoring
their
skills.
Workforce.
Exactly, yeah. Making them able to do this. And you say that, there have been warning signs that this might happen. But if Apple had noticed it hadn't taken them to heart, it had become common in the 2010s for Apple's vendors to poach its talent. One executive recalled visiting a counterpart at Foxconn in 2012 and witnessing indigenous Chinese companies recruiting talent directly in front of the Foxconn facility. Foxconn being the place, right, where Apple's kind of
main
Apple's
third-party
machines are being
vendor
made.
for this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is their guy. And outside of the Foxconn facility, Apple's workers are being poached. The top engineer who had just spoken to the recruiters recognized both executives and shook their hands. It was a pleasure working with you, he said. I'm working for Huawei now. The two men dumbstruck stood in silence while the engineer walked off. The Apple executive then turned to the Foxconn executive and asked, who the F is Huawei? So,
yes.
yeah, this completely blindsided us, or at least it was like a
by the
really
way,
rapid.
all credit to Patrick McGee for finding anecdotes like that. It's part of what makes his book so fascinating. In addition to a former VP at Apple saying, I was there in the early 2000s, and I think you're oversubscribing to your thesis. We weren't thinking about politics or geopolitics at all. McGee sort of goes, yeah. Exactly. That is in
that's
fact
the problem,
thesis.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of what I'm indicating, right?
Right. So
yeah,
if I can just say something really quick, when it comes to these changes, I think we need to do some calibration is in order. Look, liberal democracy has spread over the world, perhaps farther than any aristocratic elite in any domain might have anticipated. I mean, Tocqueville writes of this as a threat, and to some degree, this is wildly successful. I don't want to discount that. There are limits. After all, your opposition gets to vote, and one of those voters ended up being Xi Jinping. And he saw a few things happening in the 2010s, is that he thought the company had opened too much to the West. This is when Apple, by the way, is almost ebullient about the idea of this younger Chinese generation and its workforce actually fomenting this liberalizing change. They're not scarred by the communist past. They're open to the West. They think, my God, this might actually be happening. And Xi has a very different idea of what's happening here. Is he sees the West as having greatly taken advantage of China's openness. And he sees what happens with American social media companies and the Arab Spring. And he says, this is a huge problem for our sovereignty. We need to figure this out. Now, one of the strange things that McGee gets into is that Apple was flying out 55 people a day from Cupertino to China at one point, investing billions of dollars into China. And why would Xi have an issue with that? Well, the part was Apple hid that even from their own shareholders. That was their secret sauce. So they also hid it from the CCP. No one really knew the extent of their embeddedness in the Middle Kingdom. And then Apple had to make that explicit to deconflict some tensions with Xi's government. That changes the calculus of everything. And China has been also very clear about sort of where it sees the future going. It's taken a look at what happened recently in Iran, and it's taken a look at the rise of Donald Trump. And what China did was it drafted off of the American order. It took advantage of its openness and its open sea lanes and all of these things towards its own advantage while playing sort of a background role, right? Not being too braggadocious, not being that. That was intentional. But Trump, they see as this dual figure. Trump, who has named the issue, which now means they can no longer play this background role in what's unfolding in geopolitics. And also structurally, they can no longer do that because they're simply too dominant across key economic lines, like critical minerals, for example. That is hugely important to the Chinese future and them reestablishing themselves as a great power player in the world. However, they also view Trump, and this is their perspective, to be clear, as a figure of decline. And that is what makes America dangerous now. Not that it is this resurging peer, but that it is a fading empire that will lash out wildly in unpredictable ways as the crown slips from its head. That is the calculus from Beijing right now.
Remarkable. And I would imagine under those circumstances, I could see very clearly, for example, how the recent escapade in Iran would fit into that story. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, since you wrote this piece, it seems, or it feels from a kind of vibes-based look at the newspapers, that China has faded in an interesting way from the American public consciousness. There was a period where the rise of China as our major adversary and the kind of sudden shock of their maximal competence, and even the fear that they might have outstripped us or surpassed us in some of the ways that Xi Jinping would probably like to endorse, that was extraordinarily present in the zeitgeist for the commentariat. That was something everyone was talking about. Even before the war in Iran, one had the sense that this was no longer the kind of top note or tonic note of the song commentators and observers were singing. Do you think that that is intentional on China's part? In other words, if you're saying that there's a kind of wait and see, just stand back and let your enemies make their mistakes demeanor or strategy, is that what's happening? Or why do you think that we've shifted our attention elsewhere?
I think there are a few issues. I mean, first of all, it's while we're not seeing quite the same level of runaway inflation, in my understanding, we're not seeing great reductions either. People care about that, obviously. It affects their quality of life. The price of the pump jackknifed upward
Yes,
during this Iran escapade, and that was felt by all, in addition to all of this. And now we have the entire kerfuffle over data centers and AI, which has sort of replaced both climate and China as ongoing concerns. And I think a lot of this is also downstream of how the U.S. military is structured, how its commands are structured, right? So Indo-PACOM, which looks over, what's happening in East Asia, et cetera. There's been this idea, and there have been champions like Colby Elbridge who are, forwarding this, that we need to do this pivot to the East. But Central Command still hoovers up tons of munitions, tons of power, and keeps us focused in the Middle East, which is not to say we want to neglect the Middle East. We have crucial allies or ally, perhaps, in the Middle East, but,
right.
This is a real concern because that constrains the amount of attention that can be put elsewhere, where concerns are perhaps even more pressing in a longer term front. So I think that's all to say that there are things happening at the grassroots level politically that have diverted people's attention, and that there are institutional path dependencies that will be very painful to shift, very difficult to shift, that are slowing this amongst the elite and leadership class for how we're going forward here. And again, we still haven't priced in what the fallout of this Iran conflict has been and how that's going to reshape things. And I should add to this, you brought up that, on the left, there's been this thing of like, there is a sort of baked in like Howard Zinnian restraint to what happens, a Chomskyan restraint, if you will, to what America should be doing. And that comes for contempt for or indifference to the continuation of the American regime. And that is a very different posture than what happens on the right, which is a question of what's best for the American regime. Now, I get into why certain people, especially young people, we've seen this slate of DSA candidates, of which I was once a member, to be clear. So I think I have a little bit of extra insight here, rise upwards in New York, largely through the votes of young people, especially disenfranchised feeling professional managerial class members. And what's happened is there is a cultural issue that has a material substrate that I describe in the piece, and I wish I could take credit for this term, as historical nihilism, a sort of eschewing the founding mythos of America. Now, this is what someone identified as what ultimately killed the USSR. Once they could no longer believe in Lenin or Stalin or the communist dream, it was impossible for the leadership class to cohere and rally and actually, affect change meaningfully within the regime. The person who gave the speech and making that analysis is Xi Jinping himself. And that is where I close the piece. What we have is a pervasive problem of historical nihilism that has to do with this strange, I would say, I was just reading a piece about this the other day, this strange view that it doesn't matter who's the dominant power in the world. Perhaps it's bad if America is. People don't see their futures as, attached to the success of the regime. Perhaps they see it as jailed to its decline, and that's a real issue for them. And they feel a sense of diminishing prospects. And in some ways, when we look at Russ Green's total boomer luxury communism, where we are extorting young people and giving their wages to already wealthy retirees. There is a civilizational problem here that is very demoralizing. China taxes its people less than we do, for example. And that is part of how they retain a certain level of regime legitimacy. So when we put all that together, this is sort of the bummer mood that we were talking about at the beginning and where we're at. And I think that it is going to require both savvy conservatives, but, and I believe these people still exist, patriotic Democrats to really step up and figure out how to culturally and institutionally shape this country in a way that divests the energies that are animating this historical nihilism.
I think I'm really glad you've gone here because you've anticipated to some extent where I wanted us to close, but let us just dwell and take another pass at this. I think this concept of historical nihilism, which you, as you say, land on at the end of this piece, and which has a fascinating kind of Marxist inflection that we can bring into conversation with everything we were just saying about John Quincy Adams and so forth, right? Like, of course, conservatives are fond of dumping on Marx, and often for good reason. But if we think about the implications of a term like historical nihilism, we see in mirror image or silhouette the appeal of something like Marxism, which is that it entails historical optimism, actually of an intense kind, probably too much historical optimism, right? This trust in the future, in history, in progress is going to take us somewhere better than we are now. And so what Xi Jinping is observing with a certain degree of canniness is that if you have the opposite of that, if you have a sense that the future can only be downhill, is destined to pitch us into decline, then of course it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's going to be all kinds of noping out on every front. And I think you're right that traditionally leftists are more inclined to be pessimistic about the future of America or the rightness of American hegemony. However, it's also the case that the most kind of energetic and even perhaps loud news strains of conservatism or right-wingery have a flavor of this as well now, that America is in decline, that America has fundamental flaws, for example, which we addressed a lot at Claremont, that, there's something wrong with the founding, and so it can only explode or implode. So that nihilism is now, I think it's fair to say, bipartisan and pervasive in all these ways that you've described. At the same time, I want to return in closing here to the thing that you mentioned, which is important, that we can look at the recent past and be a bit down on ourselves about our wars of regime change and our expeditions and our kind of, let's say, hubris, right, about the inevitability, our almost a Marxist or progressivist idea about the inevitability of liberal democracy in the future. But looking at it from the point of view of if you teleported John Quincy Adams into 2026 and took this sort of more historical, centuries-long approach, in fact, by and large, it has been an astonishing kind of revolution, worldwide revolution in sentiment and sensibility, to the extent that even those countries which don't really have legitimate liberal democracies find themselves often in the position of needing to pay lip service to or to qualify their systems as actually having all the virtues that liberal democracy or the American Constitution claims for itself. Case in point, why is it the democratic socialists of America? Why is it that there's a need to qualify the world socialist with a reference to democracy? Well, because everyone now thinks that democracy is a good thing, and socialism has this track record that people find a little bit stinky, and so you have to kind of, why is it a democracy with Chinese characteristics? Actually, I think it's a Xi Jinpingism, right? Like Xi Jinpingism, all of this just to say, is it possible, since we're in the business now, we're about to transition into looking at America from this like 250-year long vantage point. do we need perhaps to contextualize the moment we're going through as like not necessarily the last word on American history? And what would be the right framing, in your view, for those optimistic Democrats and Republicans who do want to see America kind of enter a new era of greatness or what have you? What would be the right way of understanding our current position vis-a-vis our historical trajectory?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot, and I've probably only come up with provisional answers to this question. To be complete, and that's not because I'm a doomer. I'm very long America. I still believe that this is the best regime structure, and in particular, the best regime structure for the American people, for whom it was designed. However, I think that one of the things that both left and right need to figure out how to defeat is this twist of mind where there is absolute institutional pessimism with maximum faith in managerial institutions to garner benefits in the correct way on everyone. That is a bizarre thing that I've watched happen over the course of my lifetime. Now, perhaps it predates that. Everybody has their own flavor of presentism based on, the life that they're actually living. However, that is something I think our generation has been unfortunately deft at, making widespread in America. And so what does that look like? I see a lot of hope coming out of what's going on with the hard tech space in Silicon Valley. It is important that people are sending rockets into space and wanting to work with NASA to build moon bases, and creating autonomous vehicles for air, land, and sea, et cetera, and being very open about what it's like to build a new nuclear plant or something like that. I think I was just in Detroit for Reindustrialize, and of course that's going to have a selection bias, but I will point out there were fewer protesters there than the last time. I did not personally get called a baby killer this time, which was very nice. That happened on my
Maybe
way
you're just
in.
falling down on your game, dude. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
You gotta up
I was
those
just
numbers.
like, clearly my stock is going down, is what I'm finding. No, but one thing that is clear is that this is to the future. Like the future belongs to builders, is what I'm trying to say. And the American story that we need to double down on is one of building. It is, you can just go do things. This has been what I think is the unappreciated feature of the Trump term, the second term, that I don't know if Beijing has accurately estimated, is that it is now teaching our leaders that we can actually do many things that are effective. There have certainly been mistakes made, follies. That happens all the time in politics. Everybody's dealing with, imperfect knowledge sets and perhaps even less good suites of choices to make based on that imperfect information by dint of their human nature, of course. And I think that the victories, things like that are coming out of the energy industry right now, things that are happening, like I said, in this building space, is far less abstract, more tangible, and more inspiring. Everything is a monument to American greatness here. And I think that is the energy that both sides need to converge on if we're going to take this over the line. The way that the data center story has played out is a shame. The fact that we say, well, we're building so many data centers that actually we don't have enough blue collar people to hire at high paying jobs. This is a huge problem. I'm like, I want more of that problem, please. Get like a problem? What are you talking about? This is the revitalization that we've all been calling for. And we have this moment where we could really fumble this or figure out. And of course, the frontier labs have their own problems with comms, as we all know. But getting this moment right is really about setting up America for the next 50 years, in my opinion. And that's what we have to do. We have to reinstantiate what Lincoln said, is that the whole world is a mine and every man is a miner.
I love this. All right. Well, that's a fitting ramp to hit the pedal on as we go up into America 250. America 250. You can just build things. Emmet Penney, terrific. Well, this was a delight. I should have said at the beginning that Emmet Penney is the a senior fellow of the Foundation for American Innovation, and if you visit their website, you can find more of his work. You can also find it at Claremont Review of Books. claremont.com. On the eve of our America 250 bash, I have a few notes and things to let our listeners know about. First of all, new issue of CRV is coming out. Our summer issue has gone to the printers. It'll be online soon, and shortly after that, it'll be in your mailbox if you are a subscriber. If you are not a subscriber, and you're listening to my voice right now, we need to have a serious talk, and you need to look at your life and your choices, because this ain't gonna fly. I genuinely think
I co-signed this, by the way, as a guest on the show and subscriber.
That's why I haven't had you sign off yet, Emmett. I was hoping that you would join me in this. Add your voice as a non-biased outside observer, not being on the masthead. You can confirm that there must be some serious flaws in your life choices to date if you're not yet.
Can I add to this pitch, by the way?
Oh, please. Yes. This is not. I didn't pay Emmett to say this, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So just to be clear, for everyone listening, as I mentioned, I was in the DSA before. There are a lot of changes that happened that brought me onto this other side of the aisle, and we don't need to go into them here. But one of the important things that happened was being introduced to the thinkers and writers of the CRB and Claremont in particular. I've been rereading Christopher Caldwell's Age of Entitlement, and I'm remembering now how eye-opening it was for me when I was in a period of great political philosophical doubt, how important it was for where I've ended up now. And he's just one of many writers in these pages who have impacted me. So this is to say, don't just subscribe. There are gift subscriptions you can get. If you run an institution, subscribe on behalf of your institution. We are at this inflection point of the 250th anniversary of America, and it behooves us to double down on the founding, to fully appreciate our political philosophical heritage, and to carry this message forward. It is impactful. I've seen it happen in my own life, and I'm grateful for it.
That was beautiful. Thank you, Emmett. And we should also say that you are a 2026 Lincoln Fellow. So that's one of our educational programs that we run. We're very much looking forward to having you this summer. And you can support with gifts that are specifically aimed at those educational programs, which I think are some of the best things that we do, which I do say kind of disinterestedly because I'm mostly involved with the writing side of things. But anytime I visit the fellowships, I am so moved and honored to be a part of this organization for that reason as well. Because if you need to examine your life choices when you're not yet a subscriber to CRB, if you're a member of the DSA, you really need to examine your life choices. And the way that we can help you to do that is by reading the Claremont Review of Books. You've also set me up.
Bestie.
Hashtag mood. So the way that you've actually set me up perfectly for the next thing that I have to say, which is that we've got this commemorative booklet that we've put together. Initially, it's going to be on Substack. That is a collection of pieces from across the years of CRB called American Independence, a celebration from the Claremont Review of Books, 250 Years of America. This will be available online, and our Substack is claremontinstitute.substack.com, which is another way that you can sign up and support us. But you also can get a commemorative physical copy of this compilation, which I really think is a beautiful kind of coffee table book, or it'll be a wonderful addition to your library. You get one for free if you are a Claremont Institute Society member, which is to say you're one of our leading supporters, and we're enormously grateful to you for that. You get a printed commemorative booklet of American independence. However, if you're not one of those Claremont Institute Society members, you can also get one of these printed copies for a single gift of $250 to the Claremont Review of Books. If you want to make a donation at that level, go to claremont.org/donate, and you can make the note that you're designating that gift specifically to CRB, and then we will send you, while supplies last, one of these. We're doing a limited print run on this booklet. So that's the other thing that I had to mention. Beyond that, happy 250th anniversary of this greatest country on earth. We will look forward to celebrating with you with the new issue of the CRB and with further episodes of the Close Read to come. Thanks, as always, to Ryan Gannon, the indefatigable Ryan Gannon, who at this point is editing more podcasts than I have time to host, which is really saying something. If you know the kind of recording I'm doing,
if you're
Ryan
a
is
Klavan ball
actually,
knower, be impressed.
if you're a completist, yeah, you will be aware that this is truly high praise. So Gannon deserves all of our gratitude for making us look and sound at least decent and passable. And you too, dear listener, though I've given you a little bit of a hard time if you're not a subscriber, anyone who's listening to this show, we just deeply appreciate it. We're very glad to share this material with you. And you can help support us for free by rating, reviewing, sharing, and subscribing, and boosting us more generally in the algorithm. That's it for now. We will talk to you next time.